This is Mr. Wesley, and today we are talking about a pattern, not a theory, not a speculative framework built from limited data, a pattern that has been documented across decades of longitudinal research on long-term marriage that appears with enough consistency across cultures and demographics to deserve to be called a schedule rather than a coincidence, and that most men who have been through the ending of a long marriage will recognize, not as something they were told about before it happened to them, because nobody told them, but as something that, when it is finally described with precision, maps onto the timeline of their own marriage with an accuracy that is both clarifying and deeply uncomfortable. The pattern is this: long marriages, marriages that survive the early turbulent years, that establish functional stability, that build families and financial structures and the shared infrastructure of a life, tend to enter their most serious difficulty not randomly, not in response to a single dramatic event, and not at a point that is visible as a crisis from the outside. They tend to enter their most serious difficulty on a specific and documentable timeline that the research identifies with the consistency that should be part of every serious conversation about how long marriages actually work. And the men who are most blindsided by the ending of their marriages, the men who describe the collapse as something that arrived without warning, that made no sense given how stable things appeared, that they genuinely did not see coming, are almost always the men whose marriages followed this pattern and who simply did not have the framework that would have made the pattern legible while they were inside it. I am calling it the marriage expiration. Not because marriages are products with a predetermined shelf life that cannot be extended, not because the pattern is deterministic or that any marriage that enters it is inevitably going to fail, but because the metaphor is precise in a way that matters. The expiration of a marriage is not a sudden event. It is a process that begins well before the moment when it becomes visible, that runs on a biological and psychological schedule that is largely independent of the conscious intentions of the people inside the marriage, and that produces its most serious consequences in the period when it is least recognizable from the outside as the emergency it actually is. Today I am going to give you that framework, the one that would have made the pattern legible when it mattered. Not to make the past make more sense in a comfortable way. Making the past comfortable is not what this channel is for. But because the same pattern that ended your marriage is the pattern you need to understand clearly before you enter any new relationship, before you give advice to the young men in your life, and before you attempt to make sense of where you are now and how you got here, the pattern is real. It is readable. And a man who can read it is a man who is navigating a fundamentally different landscape than a man who cannot. Stay with me. In a few minutes, I am going to walk you through the specific research on marital life cycle patterns, give you the documented timeline that the research identifies as the expiration schedule, explain the specific biological and psychological mechanisms that drive each stage of that schedule, and give you the 4 most critical intervention points. The moments when the pattern is most interruptible, and when the decisions made have the largest leverage on whether the marriage survives or follows the pattern to its conclusion. There is one specific stage of the timeline in particular that I want you to be able to identify clearly before this video ends. Not because it is the most dramatic stage, but because it is the stage where the gap between how things appear and what is actually happening is the largest, and where that gap is the most expensive. But first, you need to understand why the pattern exists, the biological and evolutionary foundation of it. Because without that foundation, the timeline I am going to give you will feel like a list of facts rather than the explanation of a mechanism. And mechanisms are what you can actually use. I am Mr. Wesley. I have spent years working alongside men who were trying to understand what happened to marriages that had appeared from the outside and often from the inside to be fundamentally stable. Men who had built things, who had stayed, who had maintained their commitments with a consistency that the culture rewards in principle and fails to protect in practice. And what I kept seeing, across the variety of their specific stories, was the same underlying pattern, the same timeline, the same sequence of stages, the same moments where an intervention was possible and was not made because nobody had shown the man inside the marriage what he was looking at. This is Relational Insights. And this is the schedule that somebody should have shown you before you needed to see it. Let me give you the biological foundation. First, human pair bonding, the specific form of long-term romantic attachment that marriage is designed to formalize and sustain, is a biological phenomenon with a specific neurochemical architecture. The early stages of romantic attachment are driven by a specific cocktail of neurochemicals, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, that produce the intense focus, the elevated energy, the specific quality of absolute priority that the person you are newly in love with occupies in your attention and your motivation. Researchers who study the neuroscience of romantic love have documented that this early-stage neurochemical state is physiologically comparable, in several measurable ways, to the neurological profile of obsessive-compulsive disorder and addiction. The early stage of romantic love is not, in the neurological sense, a stable state. It is an elevated and unsustainable state. And the research is consistent about what happens to it across time. The neurochemical intensity of early romantic attachment begins to decline typically between 18 months and 3 years into a relationship. This decline is not pathological, it is biological. The neurochemical systems that were producing the intensity of early attachment are not designed to sustain that intensity indefinitely. They are designed to produce it at sufficient intensity for long enough to establish a lasting pair bond, and then to transition toward the neurochemical profile of a different and more sustainable form of attachment. The research calls this transition from passionate love to companionate love. It is a normal, universal, and biologically driven transition that happens in every long-term relationship. And it is the first stage of the marriage expiration pattern because it is the first point at which the subjective experience of the marriage begins to diverge from what was experienced at its beginning. And the first point at which that divergence, if it is not recognized and addressed, begins to create the conditions for the pattern to run. The transition from passionate to companionate love is not the problem. Companionate love, the attachment, the familiarity, the specific and deep comfort of knowing and being known by another person across years of shared life, is a genuine and valuable form of connection that is distinct from early-stage passionate love but not inferior to it. The problem is the cultural and personal framework through which most people, and most men specifically, interpret the transition when it happens. The culture has not equipped most men with a framework for understanding this transition as normal and navigable, as a biological shift that requires conscious adaptation in how the marriage is maintained, rather than a signal that something is fundamentally wrong with the relationship. Most men experience the transition as a reduction in the marriage's intensity without understanding what the reduction means and what it requires of them. They experience a quieting and a settling of what had been vivid and primary, and they adapt to that quieting by reducing the conscious investment they make in the maintenance of the marriage, because the marriage no longer seems to require the same level of attention that it required when everything felt urgent. And that reduction in conscious investment is the first and most consequential contribution to the expiration timeline. Now let me give you the timeline. These are the 7 stages of the marriage expiration pattern as the research documents them, with the typical timeframes and the key behavioral and psychological markers of each stage. Stage 1 runs from the beginning of the marriage through approximately years 2 to 4. This is what researchers call the bonding consolidation phase. The neurochemical intensity of early attachment is still present in modified form. Both partners are still in the process of building the shared identity and the shared infrastructure of the partnership. Conflict in this stage, when it occurs, is typically resolved with relative ease because both partners are still operating with the elevated motivational priority that early-stage attachment produces. The marriage in this stage is resilient in ways that require little conscious maintenance because the biological systems that are producing the resilience are still running at sufficient intensity to compensate for the gaps in conscious skill and attention. Stage 2 runs from approximately years 3 to 7. This is the first consolidation and drift phase. The neurochemical transition from passionate to companionate love is occurring or has occurred. The practical demands of the marriage, children if they are present, career development, financial construction, the logistics of a shared life that is becoming more complex rather than less, are absorbing the time and attention that was previously available for the conscious maintenance of the emotional connection. Both partners are adapting to each other in ways that are both stabilizing and potentially problematic, developing the predictive models of each other's behavior that make coexistence efficient, but that also begin to substitute for genuine curiosity about the other person's ongoing interior development. The marriage in this stage can appear extremely stable from the outside, while the conditions for the expiration pattern are quietly being established on the inside. Stage 3 runs from approximately years 7 to 12 and is what I call the false stability phase. This is the stage where the marriage looks most solid from the outside and is often most fragile on the inside. The practical infrastructure of the marriage is fully established. The children are present, and the family identity is formed. The financial structure is running. The social presentation of the marriage as a successful unit is at its most convincing. And underneath all of that, the emotional distance that has been accumulating since the end of the bonding consolidation phase has reached a level where it is consistently felt by at least one partner, typically the wife, without being consistently acknowledged or addressed by either. This is the stage where the resentment archive I described in an earlier video is in its most active accumulation phase. The bids that are going unmet are accumulating at a rate that has crossed from the functional archive into the weighted archive, and the man in the marriage, whose framework for reading marital stability is organized around external function and visible conflict, is reading the false stability of this stage as evidence that the marriage is in good shape. Stage 4 runs from approximately years 10 to 16 and is what I call the first crisis emergence phase. This is the stage where the accumulated distance of the previous phases produces its first clearly visible symptoms. The complaints increase in frequency and intensity. The emotional distance becomes difficult to deny. One or both partners begins to feel, with a clarity that the false stability phase did not permit, that something is fundamentally wrong in the marriage in a way that the ordinary frictions of a long partnership cannot fully account for. Couples therapy is most commonly sought in this stage. Affairs are most commonly initiated in this stage by both parties, though the research shows different patterns and different motivations between male and female infidelity in this stage. The marriage in this phase is in genuine crisis, whether or not the crisis is being named as such. And the decisions made in this stage have the largest leverage on whether the pattern continues toward expiration or is interrupted. Stage 5 runs from approximately years 14 to 20 and is what I call the adaptive reorganization or departure decision phase. This is the stage where the marriage either genuinely restructures, where both partners make the specific and conscious adaptations to how they are maintaining the marriage that the accumulation of the previous stages has made necessary, or where one or both partners makes the departure decision that I have described in earlier videos. The departure decision is rarely made in this stage with the dramatic urgency of a crisis. It is made quietly, as the conclusion of a long internal process, by the partner whose bid register has crossed the threshold I described in an earlier video. The marriage in this phase may continue to look functional for years after the departure decision has been made, which is the source of the blindsiding that men in this stage consistently describe when the external events of the divorce eventually arrive. Stage 6 runs from approximately years 18 to 2005 and is what I call the long plateau or terminal detachment phase. This is the stage where marriages that have not genuinely restructured and have not yet formally ended settle into the specific and costly stasis of the dead marriage that I described in an earlier video. Both partners are present. The external function continues. The emotional life of the marriage has been largely or entirely vacated. The departure decision, if it has been made, is being held privately, while the practical and financial conditions for its execution are being established. This is the stage that costs men the most in the financial and identity dimensions I described in the retirement tax video. The stage where staying inside the expiring marriage is generating the largest ongoing costs against the smallest ongoing returns. Stage 7 is the dissolution event. The conversation, the filing, the moment when the departure decision that was made privately in an earlier stage becomes the external reality that both partners and the world around them are now navigating. For the partner who made the departure decision, this stage is the execution of a plan that has been in development for months or years. For the partner who did not make the departure decision, for the man who is blindsided by the dissolution event, this stage is experienced as an arrival without a preceding journey, as a crisis without an adequate warning period, as the end of something that he did not know was ending. That experience of blindsiding, the specific and disorienting experience of a man who experiences the dissolution event as a surprise, is almost always the product of having been in stages 5 or 6, without the framework to identify them as such. The warning was not absent. The pattern was legible. The man inside it simply did not have the map that would have made it legible to him. I want to stay here with you for a moment before I give you the 4 intervention points, because the recognition of this timeline, the specific moment when a man maps the stages I have just described onto the actual history of his own marriage and identifies with precision which stage he was in when he thought things were fine, and which stage the dissolution event arrived in, and what the gap between those stages contains. That recognition carries a specific weight that deserves to be acknowledged before we move to the practical framework. The weight of this recognition is not simple grief. It is something more complex than that. It is the specific and layered experience of understanding that the pattern was running and was readable while you were inside it, and that the information that would have made it readable was not available to you, and that the absence of that information contributed to outcomes that you are still living with. It contains grief. It contains the specific and retroactive dread of seeing the warning signs that were there but that you did not have the framework to recognize as warning signs. It contains something that is not quite anger and not quite guilt, but that partakes of both. The specific discomfort of a man who was doing his best with his available tools, and who is now seeing clearly that the available tools were not the right tools for the situation he was in. I want you to sit with that recognition without rushing it toward a resolution it has not yet earned. The recognition itself is valuable. The weight of it is real. And the man who sits with it honestly, who does not minimize it into a manageable story or inflate it into a consuming grievance, is the man who comes out the other side of it with something he can actually use. Now here are the 4 intervention points. The 4 moments in the marriage expiration timeline, where the pattern is most interruptible, and where the decisions made have the largest leverage on the outcome. The first intervention point is the end of the bonding consolidation phase, approximately years 3 to 5. This is the moment when the neurochemical transition from passionate to companionate love is occurring, and when the first conscious investment in the maintenance of the marriage's emotional economy is most needed and least often made. The man who understands what this transition is and what it requires, who adapts his investment in the marriage's emotional maintenance to compensate for the reduction in the biological systems that were previously doing that work automatically, is the man who navigates stage 2 without establishing the conditions for the pattern to run. The man who does not understand the transition reads the quieting of early-stage intensity as evidence that less investment is required, invests less, and begins the accumulation of emotional distance that will become critical in later stages. The second intervention point is the false stability phase, approximately years 7 to 12. This is the moment when the resentment archive is in its most active accumulation phase, and when the man's framework for reading marital health, organized around external function and the absence of visible crisis, is most systematically misleading him about the actual state of the marriage's interior. The man who has the framework to read the false stability phase accurately, who understands that external stability and internal health are not the same thing, and who is monitoring the 4 channels of female emotional signaling I described in an earlier video, is the man who identifies the accumulation while it is still in the weighted archive stage rather than after it has crossed into the critical archive. The man who reads the false stability as evidence of genuine health invests nothing in the interior of the marriage during this stage and arrives at stage 4, the first crisis emergence, without the relational resources that the crisis requires. The third intervention point is the first crisis emergence phase, approximately years 10 to 16. This is the moment when the pattern is most clearly visible, and when the intervention that is most available is couples therapy that is genuine rather than performative. I want to be specific about the distinction because it matters. Performative couples therapy, therapy that both partners attend without genuine commitment to the interior work it requires, that is used as evidence of having tried rather than as a genuine vehicle for the restructuring the marriage needs, does not interrupt the pattern. It delays the next stage while adding to the resentment archive on the side of the partner, whose genuine engagement with the therapy is met with the other partner's performance of engagement. Genuine couples therapy, therapy where both partners are doing the actual interior work of examining their patterns, developing the specific skills of emotional availability and repair fluency, and making the conscious adaptations to how they are maintaining the marriage that the accumulation of the previous stages has made necessary, can interrupt the pattern at this stage. The intervention point is real and accessible. What is required to use it is the willingness to engage with it genuinely rather than performatively. That willingness is rarer than the attendance at the sessions. The fourth intervention point is the adaptive reorganization stage, approximately years 14 to 20. This is the last moment when the pattern is genuinely interruptible before the departure decision crosses the threshold of irreversibility. The intervention that is most available at this stage is not couples therapy. It is what I described in an earlier video as the experience of being genuinely seen by your partner, the specific and non-performative shift from managing the marriage to being genuinely present within it, from providing for the partnership to genuinely inhabiting it, from fulfilling the external requirements of the role to actually showing up as the specific person your partner has been trying to reach across the years of the marriage. This intervention is the most demanding of the 4 because it requires the most fundamental shift in how the man inside the marriage is engaging with it. And it is the most powerful of the 4 when it is genuine because it addresses the root cause of the expiration rather than a symptom of it. But it has a window. The window closes when the departure decision crosses the threshold of irreversibility. And the man who does not know the window exists cannot use it before it closes. The marriage expiration pattern is not a sentence, it is a schedule. And schedules, unlike sentences, can be interrupted by people who know what they are reading, and who make the decisions that the schedule's intervention points require. The man who has that knowledge before he needs it is the man who navigates the schedule differently from the man who encounters it without a map. The man who has it after the fact is the man who can give the people he loves the knowledge that he did not have when it would have been most useful to him. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, one of the most specific and most practically valuable things that the expensive education of a marriage's ending can produce. The knowledge itself, clearly seen, honestly held, ready to be given to the people who still have time to use it. Drop a comment. Men, Looking at the 7 stages I described today, which stage do you believe your marriage was actually in when you experienced the dissolution event? And how different was that from the stage you believed it was in at the time? Subscribe to Relational Insights. Every week, Mr. Wesley breaks down the hidden patterns of long marriage, the schedules, the mechanisms, the intervention points, with the precision and the honesty that finally gives men the map they needed before they needed it, and that is still worth having now that they do.